So let's explore how change happens. And I'm going to begin with something that I've shared with you right from the outset. This is one of my own sort of personal mantras in understanding what's needed, is this recognition that culture shapes values and values shape history, and that by the same token, our values are what will shape the future. But there's actually something a little interesting if we kind of go a little bit deeper on that concept. What we see is this notion that there's actually this kind of shared reciprocity between values and culture, that it's not just kind of one way, but actually the environment actually shapes our culture, even while our culture affects the environment. So that means that really we also kind of want to see history itself as being in a way like this kind of interactive, reciprocal, complex system of its own. But having said that, I want to kind of look a little bit deeper about how culture itself does have this impact on environment. And, you know, we looked at the first in that first session about Admiral Zheng He and how his way of looking at the world led to a totally different outcome in history than Columbus's. But I also, let's kind of look a little closer now at environments in relation to history. So I wanted to kind of take you through a bit of a scenario, if you will. Imagine an environment that could be ripe for a scientific revolution. Imagine a society that had gunpowder, like with explosives of guns, had movable type printing, large-scale iron production, a highly productive agriculture system, a massive navy with ongoing ocean-going vessels. It had the magnetic compass, a sophisticated economy with paper currency, and a cosmopolitan city with over 1 million inhabitants, where all this thing was being centered. Seems like this would be, it was, right, the environment for a scientific revolution, all these things leading to this transition, this transformation in history. But actually what I was just describing, as some of you might have guessed, was actually China. It was actually the Song dynasty, that place where Neo-Confucian thought arose in the 11th and 12th century. Of course, we know that the Song dynasty didn't actually lead to a scientific revolution. This is where it's kind of interesting to look at this kind of feedback between the environment and culture. There in China, they had the environment for a scientific revolution. They had all the things that would be needed for one sort of spark, it seems, to like flame it up. But their culture had a different way of looking at the world. They saw humans as being this integral part of the natural world, and their emphasis was on harmonizing with nature. And that led to actually a negative feedback, so that rather than taking all these ideas and leading to basically the way of thinking that led to our modern world, they actually sort of related to it in a more in a way that they just kind of, all these new ideas that came got sort of infiltrated into the system that was already there. And of course, we know by contrast that scientific revolution did happen in Europe in the 17th century. And there, if you look at what happened, we see a very different culture, that a similar kind of environment in terms of all the sort of sophisticated industrial and economic stuff that was going on. But in addition to that, you had these themes that we've looked at for these last few weeks, seeing nature as a machine, looking at this notion of man, as they would think about it, man's dominion over nature, the importance of measurement of things, seeing reason as the source of divinity, seeing mathematics itself like as the language of God, and this kind of goal of humans in this sort of cosmos to conquer nature, leading to this overriding theme the conquest of nature. It's like basically you can think of it like a shared symbolic network of meaning. And you remember Francis Bacon, I quoted a few weeks ago, talking about we need to establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race over the universe and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And what you see there is this kind of powerful cultural sort of impetus for this transformation, this shared symbolic network of meaning, just in the same way that in a tropical rainforest, the forest itself creates its own climate, and then it rains on the forest, which keeps everything moist and alive, which then creates more clouds. Similarly, this is like this kind of cloud of this idea that rains and fertilizes these ideas that led to this transformation. And, I'm not saying this in terms of a moral good or bad about it. This is what actually happened. And it was this positive feedback that led to this transformation in the scientific revolution, which led, as we know, as we've explored, to basically Europe conquering and plundering the rest of the globe for the last few hundred years. So that's just one concept to have in place. I'm going to explore about 4 different key concepts, each of which is separate about how change happens and which relate to each other. So keep this in your mind, this notion of how culture sets this kind of reinforcing feedback mechanism towards change. And now let's look at another very significant aspect to cultural transformation, which is notion of a non-linear path of change. One of the things we see about change is that it does not happen in a straight line. It looks like we're going along in a particular place, something transitions, and we hit almost a completely different place, sometimes very unexpectedly. And we can recognize this in terms of the shift in which and how the general population in a society relates to new ideas that arise. There are these kind of basically like these 3 phases. There's an early adoption phase when new ideas are out there, but there's this concept of what's called ideological lock-in. People are stuck in their ways of thinking. We've talked about it in terms of worldviews. People have a worldview. They see things a certain way. They have received attitudes and opinions, even when they become out of date. And that leads to social rigidity, political inertia. And the primary thing you'll hear among the mainstream when new ideas start to arise is, it'll never happen. But then at certain points, we hit a tipping point. And a tipping point can be characterized as being like a sort of a crescendo of change. And you notice a tipping point, I think one time it's when you see influential thought leaders attracting increasing numbers. That's almost like the forward layer of that tipping point you see happening. And humans, we evolved, and we've talked about part of our evolutionary heritage is this need to be part of a community, and this kind of identity, this group identity, and to have sort of shared values with those around us. That leads to what we often talk about from a derogatory point of view as this herd instinct. But that herd instinct also can lead to shifting direction towards new ways of thinking when those thought leaders start to lead the way. And that stickiness of the old thinking gets to be superseded by a pull of new ideas. So you see this kind of turmoil within society as these changes are happening. And that's that curve that goes very steeply up. And then it begins to stabilize in a new stable state, where new ways of thinking become institutionalized. There's still always going to be minorities that are the sort of diehard reactionaries who, want to get back to the old system, but they, rather than being the dominant voice, they are now become more and more the minority voice. And then everyone looks around, and the same people who said maybe some years earlier, it'll never happen, now look back and say, it was inevitable. Because it's just so clear once you look back and see what actually happens. Now, we see this kind of transformation. We've seen this in different elements, even though our overall culture and worldview has remained relatively stable the last couple hundred years, we've seen massive transformation within that. Where we've seen this kind of nonlinear crescendo of change. Women's suffrage is a great example. Just by one example, back in 1897, Emmeline Pankhurst, led this, founded this National Union for Women's Suffrage, like an almost unthinkable idea back then. And, it took her 10 years to muster up 3,000 people to march in London for women's right to vote. And they had to fight. They got sent to jail. They got told women who stood up for this were alienated from their families. They were made to feel shame that they were undermining the basic values of their society. And just 20 years later or so, even like 10 years, I guess, after that march, in the UK, women began to gain the right to vote. And then that spread, of course, throughout the world. Over a number of years. We see that here in the United States, in the civil rights movement. Just there in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat in the bus. There was this bus boycott in Montgomery lasting over a year. Black churches were burned, Black citizens arrested. Less than 10 years later, there's Martin Luther King leading that March on Washington with 200,000 people there with his famous speech, I Have a Dream. And within just a year from that, the Civil Rights Act was passed into law by President Johnson. Now, of course, we know we have so far to go, and we're not even close to fair representation of the Black voice in the U.S. community right now. But this was this incredible transformation that occurred within a very short time, surprising pretty much everybody. We see that with same-sex marriage. Believe it or not, like just in 1996, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, signed the Defense of Marriage Act with veto-proof majorities, codifying the non-recognition of all same-sex marriages for all federal purposes. I have friends who now are married who said they never thought they would be able to be married in their lifetime legally in the United States. Within 20 years, completely overturned, federal government recognizes same-sex marriage. And even in this divided country in America, more than 55% of Americans by that time actually approved same-sex marriage. We see it more recently, something like the Me Too movement. Tarana Burke first used the phrase Me Too to raise awareness of sexual assault in 2006. She had no idea that, again, within roughly 10 years, this hashtag would go viral. People like Harvey Weinstein would be arrested for sexual assault, and that this movement would be potentiated to transform these abusive cultural norms. And again, this is not to say that we've got to where we need to go in any of these areas, but the transformation we've seen is truly remarkable given where we were coming from. And now, of course, moving to climate, there's Greta Thunberg alone, just sitting outside the Swedish parliament in 2018. Just a year later, more than 4 million children and adults are taking part in this global climate strike around the world. And even though it's so far in name only rather than in practical terms, at least there's been a climate emergency declared by not just some of these nations like UK, France, but over 1,000 jurisdictions around the world, representing actually over 1 billion people now live in jurisdictions that have declared a climate emergency, even though they still need to certainly fill in the blanks from where that goes. So this just gives you a sense of how change, when it does happen, it can really take things by storm and surprise all of us, which leads to another very interesting way of understanding how that transformative change actually happens within a model. And this is called the adaptive cycle model of change. And it's a model that has been developed by actually hundreds of biologists, basically, looking at ecosystems, ecological scientists around the world, which was developed first looking at how forests have fires and regenerates, but has been shown to be a model that is actually works for just about any complex self-organized system. every kind of natural system and equally important human systems. It's called the adaptive cycle model. And it's been shown to be effective and predictive for cells, the tiniest cells, for the way evolution works on Earth, for ecosystems. So massive range in time and space of how this model works. And in human society, it's been shown to work for industries, markets, cultures, and even civilizations. So there's a lot we can learn from this model. And what this model shows us is that there are these 4 phases in the cycle of change in any of these systems. And the first of these phases is known as the growth phase. And in the growth phase, it's sort of like, imagine sort of land where things are just starting out, new different species are taking root. Innovative strategies can exploit new opportunities. In human markets, entrepreneurs can thrive. There's new products, new markets to explore, and creativity and speed are rewarded during this growth phase. And as time goes on, the system begins to mature, and we enter into what's known as the conservation phase of the system, which can last for a significant amount of time in the system. Now the system has become more stable. There's rules and well-established connections between all the different ways in which the system works, and they become crucial in setting the parameters for how the system actually goes forward. And the future appears very predictable now. You sort of know what's going to happen based on what happened in the past. But as time goes on, and it can be quite a long time in this conservation phase, the system becomes brittle, resistant to change. It becomes less resilient. In the example of a forest, this is where you get undergrowth beginning to get more and more extensive and drying out. And then it becomes more and more like a tinderbox rather than this kind of healthy, rich environment. And that leads, the system finally enters what's known as the release phase. And in a forest, that's easy to recognize. It can be just a lightning strike or something like that. A small disturbance causes this entire system to collapse. We see this in a smaller dimension in markets when the stock market or whatever market it might be looks very stable, and suddenly there's this financial panic, and like change happens almost instantaneously. And of course, as we all know, that can lead to fear. All of a sudden our moorings are getting unmoored, and that can lead to short-term responses, loss of bearings. You don't know what's happening anymore. This can be a terrifying, and it can be a short phase, or it can be a longer phase too. But ultimately, things stabilize in a new state. And now you have a renewal phase. And what's important about this renewal phase is that small chance events can drastically change the future. So in this forest, for example, some different species of plants that was outside the forest ecosystem would never have been able to invade or take root while that conservation phase was going on. But now the wind might blow it in, and a whole different species of plant might suddenly take root where there wasn't before. So in human situations, charismatic individuals can have an inordinate impact on public opinion. It's like the future is up for grabs, is the way the scientists actually talk about how we can understand the renewal phase. So of course, the natural thing to ask when we look at this adaptive cycle is, where are we in the adaptive cycle right now? And one way of thinking about where we are is to consider that, in a way, we live in this incredibly complex civilization. Really, there's different systems within the overall system, right? I mean, so people who are in the technology world, here in the Bay Area where I live, see themselves being actually part of a growth cycle. They would probably say that that's where we are right now. If we look at our cultural system, the question is, are we coming towards the end of the conservation phase? Is the transformation happening towards a different worldview, a different way of making sense of things? If we look at our ecological systems in which we're embedded, we're only too aware that we may be hitting this release phase, if you will, of our global climate system and the whole global set of ecosystems. So one of the questions is, can we move into a release phase in that cultural system to lead to a different civilization before our ecological system itself hits that collapse, which would obviously make everything else moot for what we want to try to achieve for our society? So this is just a way, again, a framework to try to think about how change happens. I'm going to move to the fourth of these frameworks now, to the final one I'm going to look at in this presentation, which somebody mentioned earlier in this course, the 3 horizons model of change, which I personally find to be incredibly useful. And I'll show you why now. The 3 horizons model is kind of, as the name implies, has 3 horizons to it. Imagine like you're on a path, and the first horizon is the one that's closest to you. Like each step you take, you're looking down, you want to make sure you're not tripping over. You're just looking right straight ahead. The second horizon might be like you're looking a little further ahead. You can sort of see a different reality that's out there. And it can look very different from where you are right now. You kind of, it's within view. You sort of know where it might be leading to. And then the third horizon is basically this notion of something that is beyond the horizon, something you can't even see right now, but it's there in the more distant future. And when we look at our world right now, we can apply this 3 horizons to looking at sort of how we look at change within our world. This, by the way, I want to give a shout out to this great book by Daniel Christian Wall, a wonderful systems thinker, wrote this book, Designing Regenerative Culture, that I took these graphs from. I recommend it strongly to everybody. And what we see is, if we look at the 3 horizons in terms of time frame and prevalence in our culture right now, horizon 1 tends to be more prevalent. It's the way naturally most people think. And we can think of it as like sort of sustaining innovation to the extent that it's trying to move forward at all. Like sort of keep the lights on, maintain the status quo, but try to make things better within that status quo. The second horizon, we can think more in terms of this notion of what we might call disruptive innovation, where we like identify opportunities to change the scope of what's possible. It can be exciting. It can be lead to a sense of real shifts in what way beyond that sort of keeping the lights on way of thinking. And then the third horizon is this possibility of transformative innovation, actually facilitating the transition towards something that it could be truly regenerative. And if you look at the sort of graph here, these lines that Daniel Wall writes in this graph, it's the notion that horizon 1 right now might be prevalent. And then we might move towards a peak where some of that horizon 2 thinking actually becomes mainstream. But the horizon 3 thinking is basically in the minority for a long time, but is planting these seeds to, in the long term, become the mainstream dominant way of thinking. Now, interestingly, there's another way to look at this 3 horizons thinking that is supplied by this great thinking systems thinker, Donella Meadows. And she wrote this great book, Thinking in Systems. And she wrote a paper similar to this book about leverage points, places to intervene in a system. And she came up with these 9 leverage points, which actually map really powerfully onto that 3 horizons way of thinking I was just showing you. So in her way of thinking, she talked about some of the less effective ways to intervene, to transform the system, are things like changing the standards you use, changing the material flows, changing information flows, things that are important, but don't actually change the system itself. Then what maps onto Horizon 2, more sort of transformative thinking, is things like changing the rules of the system, like incentives, or changing the distribution of power over the rules of the system. Those are very important to do. That's, but still not quite in that the most effective way to intervene in a system, in her mind, really maps onto Horizon 3, which is changing the goals of the system, or the actual paradigm, the mindset out of which the system itself arises. So this is just a very, almost like two different perspectives on looking at the same kind of framework for how change works. Now, these have been somewhat conceptual, what I've been taking you through so far. I'm going to give you some actual examples of sort of manifestations of change, if you will. And I'm going to do a little sort of quiz, which you can just kind of test yourself, because I'll give you the answers right away. But just think for yourself. Let's look at, for example, this is a poster that I took a picture of at Newark Airport a few years back, talking about their Terminal 4. Terminal 4 is green, they say, sustainable fun fact about Terminal 4, it's LEED certified. So the question is, which horizon, if it's something like making an airport terminal, a green terminal, which horizon would you see that as existing in? Well, I would view that as a typical example of Horizon 1, incremental change, making things looking better, but without really changing too much underlying systems around it. What about the Tesla? Now one of the most valuable companies in the world, super exciting, the electrical vehicle transforming basically the automotive industry. Which horizon do you see the Tesla as being? And by the way, I just want to say as I'm going through these, there's not necessarily a right answer to some. Some I feel are pretty definitive myself, and some are more open to conversation. This is more like a way of exploring these questions rather than coming up with definitive answers. But personally, I view the Tesla as being very much Horizon 2, sort of iconic for Horizon 2. It's a paradigm shift within the industry. It's like, it's exciting, it's transformative, but it's still within the same growth-based capitalist system. A new car still entails all the mining and stuff. It's all consumer-based. It's about growing as much as possible. This kind of white savior billionaire who's going to save the world with the new technology or whatever. What about a voluntary certification or incorporating in certain types to become more ecologically beneficial, like a benefit corporation or B Corp certified? The way that it's done right now, where it's voluntary, all these different companies have chosen to become benefit corps and actually be measured on all these different stakeholders rather than just making money at the expense of everything else. Which horizon do you see these benefit corps or B Corps in under this kind of voluntary model? Well, personally, I view that as kind of somewhere between Horizon 1 and Horizon 2. And it's sort of Horizon 2 in terms of it's a different way of thinking about corporations, but it's sort of Horizon 1 in the sense that it's really incremental. It has virtually no impact on the world as it is right now because it's voluntary. And the big corporations, even if they pay lip service to these ideas, it doesn't change how they perform. But then what about, just like we looked at last week, if a triple bottom line was required for corporate charters, fundamentally reorganizing them, and they only got those charter renewals at the discretion of consumer representatives? Which horizon would that be in? To me, I would see that as Horizon 3. That's really changing the underlying system itself. So I'll just take you through a couple more examples here. Here in the Bay Area, there's this wonderful permaculture organization called the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center. It supports communities to design for sustainable futures, permaculture design. It does wildland restoration, models resiliency, trains change makers, and is into like community capacity building. Which horizon do you see them being? I see them as being Horizon 3. They're small by themselves. They're not changing the world, but they're planting those seeds for that transformed way of thinking that we need. There's this organization, Stop Ecocide, that the founder, Polly Higgins, who passed away a couple of years back, she said how the rules of our world are laws and they can be changed. And the idea is to change the rules so that at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, ecocide would be a crime that would be an arrestable offense. So a CEO could be prosecuted for that. Which horizon do you see that in? Well, I see that somewhere between Horizon 2 and Horizon 3, to Donella Meadows' idea. You're changing the rules, you're not changing the paradigm itself, but it leads to such a profound transformation that I do see that as maybe leading the way to that third horizon itself. And one final example, what about the Declaration of the Rights of Nature at the United Nations, which has, this declaration exists, but it's not, hasn't yet been formally adopted at the UN, as having Mother Earth having the right to exist, persist, and maintain its vital cycles. Well, if that was declared at the United Nations, I would see that as a foundation for that new Horizon 3, really shifting the way formally as a human society we see our relationship with the Earth. Now, what's really valuable to look at about this Three Horizons model, so interesting, is that it's not like one of them is right and one is wrong. But what's interesting is that people who are more focused on one horizon than another tend to dismiss the other horizons. So I love this chart. It kind of shows people who are living in Horizon 1, and maybe their life's work is around Horizon 1, they see Horizon 2 think as being too risky, and Horizon 3 is basically being irrelevant. People who spend their time and energy in Horizon 2 see Horizon 1 people as obstructive, and they might see Horizon 3 as inspiring, but sort of somewhere out in the distance. And people who live their lives in Horizon 3 might see Horizon 1 as being like lunacy, and Horizon 2 as being promising, possibly, or maybe frustrating because they're not quite enough or whatever. But so this is valuable to look at because it helps for a more global perspective on change itself. And what's important about this is realizing that if you're stuck in your horizon, you do risk meeting a dead end if you're in Horizon 1 or even Horizon 2. And what's important is to identify the path to the next horizon, even while you're doing the work within your horizon. So to go back to that graph we saw earlier about how different horizons can over time become dominant. Well, if you're working in Horizon 2, just as important as doing the stuff you're doing is looking for those off-ramps where people and ideas can move towards, Horizon 1 can move towards Horizon 2. And if you are in Horizon 2, it's very valuable to look at how you can invite Horizon 1 thinkers and actors into your new horizon, and how you can be building off-ramps to Horizon 3. And just as importantly, if you're in Horizon 3, you need to be spending a lot of time looking at how you can attract Horizon 1 and 2 towards Horizon 3. And just to give you a sense of how one issue can exist and solutions can exist in different horizons, think of a polluted river. Just this totally out of control polluted river. Well, a Horizon 1 way of responding is to enforce regulations to clean up the damn river. A Horizon 2 way of responding might be to say, we need to change the rules, like an EPA act or something like that, to fundamentally shift what's allowable under this. A third horizon way of thinking about that polluted river might be to say, change the paradigm, give personhood to the river, recognize that it is a natural person with rights, just like humans. And there was this great example in Aotearoa in New Zealand of a river, the Wanganui Awa, being made a legal entity. I am the river and the river is me, is how they described it. So this hopefully gives a sense of what these Three Horizons thinking is about, and to recognize powerfully that one horizon is not right or wrong, but they're all part of this transformative shift towards that third horizon we need.